Princess Lyra stared out the viewport of her private chambers, watching the blue-green planet Earth rotate slowly beneath the Vordaxian diplomatic vessel. Her three-fingered hand pressed against the cool glass as she sighed. This assignment was both a blessing and a curse, a chance to escape her father's disappointment, but also a reminder of her failure. "Your Highness," came a voice from behind her. "The human delegation will arrive in 30 minutes. "Thank you, Trev," she replied without turning. Her attendant bowed and left her alone with her thoughts. Lyra had known since her 20th cycle that she could never bear children. The royal physicians had examined her thoroughly, their faces grave as they delivered the news to her father, King Drax. The memory still burned in her mind. His towering, scaled form rising from the throne, his gill slits flaring with rage. "Useless," he had roared, his voice echoing through the royal hall. "A princess who cannot continue the bloodline is no princess at all." The court had fallen silent. Her mother, long used to the king's temper, had simply lowered her eyes. No one defended Lyra. Now, 3 cycles later, she served as cultural ambassador to the humans, a position created specifically to remove her from court without causing political scandal. Earth was far enough away that the king wouldn't have to see his barren disappointment of a daughter. Lyra adjusted her ceremonial robes, making sure the royal crest of the Vordaxian Empire was prominently displayed. At least here, among humans who knew nothing of her personal disgrace, she could pretend to be what she was born to be: royalty. The ship's gravity shifted slightly as it docked with the orbital station. Soon she would meet the human officials assigned to work with her. Lyra studied her reflection in the glass. Her pale blue skin was smooth, her silver eyes bright against the dark markings around them. The humans found her appearance exotic, she knew. They stared when they thought she wasn't looking. "Ambassador delegation approaching, Your Highness," the ship's AI announced. "Captain James Miller will be your primary liaison." Lyra straightened her spine and moved toward the receiving chamber. She practiced the human greeting in her mind, the strange custom of shaking hands that her species found both primitive and unnecessarily intimate. When the airlock doors slid open, Lyra was surprised. She had expected a group of stern-faced officials. Instead, only one human entered, tall by their standards, with dark hair and eyes that reminded her of the deep oceans of her homeworld. "Princess Lyra," he said, bowing instead of extending his hand. "Captain James Miller, it's an honor to meet you." He had bothered to learn Vordaxian customs. "Interesting." "The honor is mine, Captain," she replied, noting how his eyes widened slightly at her perfect command of his language. "I hope to make your stay on Earth productive and pleasant," he continued. "I studied Vordaxian culture extensively and understand the importance of your mission here." What he couldn't understand was that her mission was meaningless, a way to hide royal shame. But as their eyes met, Lyra felt something unexpected. For the first time since her diagnosis, someone was looking at her not as a failed princess, but simply as herself. "Perhaps," Lyra said carefully, "you could tell me more about your world over the meal that has been prepared." Captain Miller smiled, and Lyra found herself strangely fascinated by this simple human expression. "I would be delighted, Your Highness." Neither of them could have known in that moment how this simple meeting would one day shake the foundations of 2 worlds and send King Drax into a rage that would echo across the stars. 3 months into her Earth assignment, Princess Lyra found herself looking forward to her meetings with Captain Miller. What had begun as formal diplomatic sessions had slowly transformed into something she couldn't quite name. "You're saying humans used to believe the stars were holes in the sky?" Lyra asked, walking beside James through the botanical gardens of the International Space Cooperation Center. James laughed. "Some cultures did, yes. What did Vordaxians think before space travel?" "That stars were the eyes of our ancestors, watching us," she replied, noticing how James always listened with genuine interest to her answers. They stopped at a bench overlooking a small pond where earth fish swam lazily in circles. The garden dome's artificial sunlight warmed Lyra's skin in a pleasant way that reminded her of home. Your security detail seems less obvious today, James noted casually. Lyra smiled. I convinced Trev that I was safe with you. He's watching from that building. She pointed to a glass structure where her faithful attendant stood, pretending not to monitor them. Safe with me, James repeated softly. Your trust honors me, Princess. The way he said princess had changed over the weeks. It was no longer just a title, but somehow personal. Lyra felt her heart rate increase, something the royal physicians would note with concern if they were monitoring her. James, she said, testing the familiarity of using his first name, do you know why I was sent to Earth? His dark eyes studied her face. Official reason, to strengthen diplomatic ties. And the unofficial reason. James hesitated. There are rumors about my condition. He nodded slowly. Is it true, what they say? That your father considers you useless, she finished for him. Yes, a princess who cannot bear children has no value in the royal succession. I am a diplomatic prop, nothing more. James's hand moved toward hers, but stopped just short of touching. Such contact was forbidden by protocol. The physicians were wrong, he said firmly. Your value isn't determined by your ability to have children. Something strange happened then. Lyra's eyes filled with moisture, a reaction she had observed in humans, but never experienced herself. My father doesn't share your opinion. Then your father is wrong too. The boldness of his statement shocked her. No one spoke of King Drax that way. Later that evening, in her private quarters, Lyra reviewed the cultural data files on human mating rituals and reproduction. She had been studying them secretly for weeks, a curiosity she couldn't explain even to herself. All Vordaxian human diplomatic meetings are to be recorded, Trev reminded her as he delivered her evening meal. Of course, Lyra replied, quickly closing the files. Is there a message from my father? No, Your Highness. The king remains occupied with the border dispute in the Lanthian sector. After Trev left, Lyra reopened the files. According to all available research, Vordaxians and humans were genetically incompatible. Their DNA structures were fundamentally different. Reproduction between species was considered impossible. Yet she found herself drawn to James in ways that defied explanation. When her communication panel chimed with a private message from him, suggesting they meet at the observatory dome after midnight, away from official duties and watching eyes, she knew she should refuse. Instead, she accepted. That night, beneath the real stars rather than the artificial light of the garden dome, Princess Lyra of the Vordaxian Empire broke every royal protocol. When James finally reached out and touched her hand, the sensation was electric, forbidden and right. This can never be, she whispered, even as she moved closer to him. Some of the greatest discoveries in human history began with "this can never be," James replied, his voice low and certain. Neither of them knew they were about to prove the impossible possible, setting in motion events that would one day make King Drax's fury shake the foundations of two worlds. Princess Lyra bent over the sink in her private bathroom, her blue skin pale with sickness for the third morning in a row. She wiped her mouth with a cloth and caught her reflection in the mirror. The silver markings around her eyes seemed duller, and fatigue showed in the slump of her shoulders. Your Highness. Trev's concerned voice came through the door. Shall I call for the medical officer again? No, Lyra said quickly. It's just Earth food disagreeing with me. But she knew it wasn't food. For 6 weeks now, she and James had been meeting in secret, in the observatory, in rarely used sections of the diplomatic wing, once even in an Earth forest when security protocols were relaxed. What began as friendship had blossomed into something her people had no word for, but humans called love. Now her body was changing in ways that terrified her. Later that day, Lyra sat in her office, pretending to read reports while her mind raced. The symptoms matched descriptions from the human medical files she had studied, but those files also insisted what she suspected was impossible. Her communication device chimed. "James, can you meet tonight?" His message read, "The meteorology deck will be empty after 2200 hours." She sent a single-word reply, "Yes." When they met, James immediately noticed something was wrong. "Lyra, you look unwell." She turned away from him, looking out at Earth below them. "James, I need to ask you something." "Strange." He moved beside her, their reflections ghostly in the glass. "Anything. In humans, what are the early signs of pregnancy?" His breath caught. "Lyra, that's not possible." "I know." She finally turned to face him. "But I'm experiencing morning sickness, sensitivity to smells, fatigue. Exactly as your medical files describe." James stared at her, his expression shifting from shock to wonder. "How long have you felt this way?" 3 weeks, and I'm late for my cycle." His hands gently took hers. "We need to find out for certain." "I can't go to the Vordaxian medical bay," she said quickly. "If there's even a chance, my father will." "Not your doctors," James agreed. "I know someone we can trust. A human doctor who works with alien physiology. No records." 2 days later, in a small medical office far from the diplomatic sector, Dr. Anna Reed looked at test results with disbelief. "This is unprecedented," she said, looking from the display to Lyra and James. "According to everything we know about Vordaxian physiology, you can't conceive children. According to everything we know about cross-species biology, humans and Vordaxians can't reproduce together." "Yet," James prompted. "Yet I'm looking at hormone levels and cellular changes that confirm pregnancy," Dr. Reed replied. "More incredibly, the early genetic markers show both human and Vordaxian DNA, somehow reconciled in the embryo." Lyra's hands trembled as she placed them protectively over her abdomen. "How is this possible?" "I have a theory," Dr. Reed said carefully. "The Vordaxian royal family has unique genetic markers, correct? Perhaps what was diagnosed as barrenness was actually a mutation that makes you compatible with human genetics in a way regular Vordaxians aren't." The implications crashed down on them both. "If this is true," Lyra whispered, "it changes everything we thought we knew about our species." "And your father," James began. "Must never know," Lyra said firmly. "Not yet." But fate had other plans. As they left the doctor's office, neither noticed the small drone hovering near the building's entrance, standard Vordaxian security protocol for tracking the princess's movements. That night, as Lyra slept fitfully, the drone's data was processed by the ship's eye. Abnormal life signs detected within the princess's body triggered an automatic alert protocol. Trev received the medical alert on his pad, his eyes widening as he read the preliminary data. This was beyond his authority to handle alone. With trembling fingers, he opened a direct channel to King Drax's personal communicator, 19 light-years away. The message that would change everything was simple. Urgent. Medical anomaly detected in Princess Lyra. Appears to be pregnancy. Awaiting instructions. The royal summons arrived without warning. Princess Lyra was reviewing cultural exchange proposals with James when Trev burst into her office, his scales pale with fear. "Your Highness," he said, bowing lower than usual, "the king commands your immediate return to Vordax. The royal transport has already entered Earth's orbit." James and Lyra exchanged alarmed glances. They had been so careful. "On what grounds?" Lyra asked, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Trev wouldn't meet her eyes. His Majesty cites medical concerns. The room seemed to grow colder. He knew. "When must I depart?" she asked. "Within 6 Earth hours, Your Highness." After Trev left, James moved quickly to Lyra's side. "We need to run. I have friends who can hide you, get you off planet on a different route." Lyra shook her head. "He would find me, and he would kill you." She placed her hands over her still flat stomach. "The child would never be safe." "Then I'm coming with you." "Impossible," she said. "No humans are permitted on Vordax without special diplomatic credentials that take months to arrange." James paced the room. There must be something we can do. Lyra approached him and placed her blue hand against his cheek. There is. You must stay here and prepare. Find allies. Learn everything you can about Vordaxian politics. I will face my father and find supporters of my own. He could harm you, both of you. No, Lyra said with surprising certainty. Once he knows I'm carrying a child, something he thought impossible, he won't risk harming the only grandchild he may ever have, no matter its parentage. 6 hours was not enough time. They made hasty plans, exchanged emergency contact protocols, and said goodbye in her private chambers, away from watching eyes. I will find a way to reach you, James promised, holding her close. And I will protect our child until you do, Lyra whispered. When the royal transport arrived, it came with an honor guard of 12 elite Vordaxian warriors, far more than necessary for escorting a princess. Their true purpose was clear, to ensure she didn't try to escape. As Lyra boarded the ship, she caught a glimpse of James watching from a distance, his face grim with determination. She straightened her spine and raised her chin, every inch the royal princess. Whatever awaited her on Vordax, she would face it with courage. The journey took 3 weeks. Lyra spent most of it confined to her quarters, monitored constantly by medical drones. Her morning sickness worsened in space, but she refused to show weakness. When they finally reached Vordax, the royal palace gleamed under twin suns. Once, Lyra had found it beautiful. Now it looked like a prison. King Drax awaited her in the throne room, his massive frame dwarfing the ornate seat of power. His gill slits pulsed with barely contained rage as she entered and bowed. "Father," she said formally. "Do not call me that," he hissed, rising to his full height. "No daughter of mine would bring such shame to our bloodline." The court gathered around them fell silent, watching the drama unfold. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Have you allowed yourself to be defiled by a human?" Lyra met his gaze without flinching. "I carry a child, the first grandchild of your line. A half-breed abomination." He slammed his fist on the arm of the throne. "The physicians who declared you barren will be executed for their incompetence, and you will be examined thoroughly," interrupted a new voice. The royal scientist, Mev, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if the princess has indeed conceived with a human, this represents an unprecedented scientific discovery. The genetic implications alone." King Drax's eyes narrowed. "Speak plainly, scientist. This child could possess unique abilities, advantages we cannot predict. It would be unwise to act hastily." Lyra watched her father's expression shift from blind rage to calculating interest. It was exactly as she had predicted. Her child's potential value to the Empire was its best protection. "Very well," the king said finally. "The princess will remain under guard in the palace. Scientist Mev will monitor the pregnancy. We will determine the fate of her and her offspring once we know what she has created." As guards escorted her away, Lyra touched her stomach gently. The first battle was won. Her child would live. Now she just needed to find a way to contact James before the king's patience ran out. The royal medical chamber glowed with soft blue light as Princess Lyra entered her 9th month of pregnancy. Her normally slender frame had swollen dramatically. Her blue skin stretched tight over her rounded belly. 2 royal physicians monitored her constantly, recording every movement of the unprecedented child growing within her. "The energy readings are extraordinary, Your Highness," said the younger physician, Dr. Knoll, as he scanned her abdomen with a humming device. "The child's neural activity surpasses both Vordaxian and human norms." Lyra smiled faintly. Over the months of her confinement, Dr. Knoll had become her one ally in the palace. Unlike the others who treated her as a scientific curiosity, he showed genuine concern for her well-being. "And is the child healthy?" she asked, the question that mattered most to her. "Remarkably so," Dr. Knoll confirmed, "though its development follows neither human nor Vordaxian patterns exactly." From the doorway came a familiar, unwelcome voice. That is because it is neither one nor the other. King Drax entered, his massive frame filling the doorway. The physicians bowed deeply. Lyra merely inclined her head, one hand protectively over her belly. The latest reports, physicians, the king demanded. The senior physician, Dr. Mech, rushed forward with a datapad. The hybrid continues to develop exceptional abilities, Your Majesty. Preliminary scans indicate advanced neural pathways that suggest potential telepathic capabilities far beyond our own. Its cellular structure shows remarkable adaptability and resilience. The king's gill slits flared with interest. And will it survive birth? All indicators suggest yes, Dr. Mech said. The princess's body has adapted surprisingly well to nurture the hybrid. Stop calling my child the hybrid, Lyra said sharply. This is your grandchild, father. King Drax ignored her, continuing to study the medical data. And when can we expect this event? Any day now, Your Majesty, Dr. Knoll answered. The signs of impending birth are clear. The king nodded and turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. I have decided this child will be raised in the royal nursery, he announced, under my direct supervision. Fear shot through Lyra's heart. Father, no. This is not a request, Lyra. This child represents a new potential for our species. It will be trained accordingly. After he left, Lyra turned desperate eyes to Dr. Knoll. He means to turn my child into a weapon. The young physician lowered his voice. Princess, I received a strange communication today. A human transport has docked at the outer spaceport. The passenger claimed to be a specialist in cross-species medical research. Lyra's heart leaped. James, she whispered. 3 nights later, pain woke Lyra from a fitful sleep. Sharp, insistent pain that made her cry out. Dr. Knoll rushed to her side, his instruments confirming what her body already knew. The child comes, he said simply. What followed was 12 hours of labor that tested the limits of Lyra's strength. The pain was unlike anything she had imagined, tearing through her body in waves. Both physicians worked frantically, their equipment not designed for this unprecedented birth. As dawn broke over the palace, Lyra gave one final push, and a cry, neither human nor Vordaxian, filled the room. A son, Dr. Knoll announced, his voice filled with wonder as he held up the child. The baby had pale blue skin like his mother, but human-like proportions to his face and body. His eyes, when they opened, were deep brown like James's, but with silver flecks surrounding the pupils. 5 fingers on each hand instead of 3, but with faint scaling on the backs of his hands. As Dr. Knoll placed the child in Lyra's arms, the baby reached up and touched her face. In that instant, a wave of pure emotion, love, recognition, belonging, flooded Lyra's mind. The baby was communicating telepathically, something Vordaxians could only do with their closest blood relatives, and even then only faintly. He's perfect, she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. Dr. Mech rushed to report the birth to the king, but Dr. Knoll lingered. Princess, he said urgently, the human arrived in the city yesterday. He sends a message. I am closer than you think. Be ready. Lyra held her son tighter, new determination filling her. Tell him we will be. 3 days after the birth, King Drax entered the royal nursery where Lyra sat nursing her son. The king stopped in the doorway, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the floor. So this is the half-breed, he said, moving closer to examine the child. His name is Heir, Lyra said firmly, holding her son protectively. The king studied the infant with narrowed eyes. The baby stared back without fear, his brown eyes with silver flecks, seeming to assess the giant before him. The scientists want to begin testing tomorrow, King Drax announced. The child will be moved to the research wing. He's only 3 days old, Lyra protested, and already displaying remarkable abilities. The king's gill slits flared with excitement. He calmed the royal direwolf that guards my chambers. The beast lay down before him like a tamed pet. No Vordaxian in our history has shown such power over animals. Lyra looked down at her son, hiding her smile. She hadn't told anyone about Erin's growing mental abilities, how he could project feelings and simple images directly into her mind. "I need more time with him," she insisted. "The human medical files say mother-child bonding is critical in these early days." "You have until tomorrow morning," the king said, turning to leave. "Make your peace with it." After he left, Lyra pressed a hidden button on her bracelet, a signal to Dr. Knoll that she needed to speak urgently. When the young physician arrived an hour later, he checked the room for surveillance devices before speaking. "The human is inside the palace," he whispered. "He came disguised as a trader delivering rare earth plants for the royal garden. He has stealth technology unlike anything our guards have seen." Hope surged through Lyra. "When can I see him?" "Tonight. I'll create a distraction in the medical wing that will draw the guards away from your chambers for approximately 15 minutes. He handed her a small device. "Press this when it's safe. It will guide him to you." That night, after feeding Erin and placing him in his crib, Lyra dimmed the lights and waited. When the palace alarms suddenly blared from the direction of the medical wing, she counted to 50 before pressing the device Dr. Knoll had given her. Less than a minute later, a section of her wall rippled, and James stepped through, the stealth technology making it appear as if he had walked through solid stone. "Lyra," he breathed, rushing to embrace her. She clung to him, tears streaming down her face. "You came. Did you think I wouldn't?" His eyes moved to the crib. "Is that your son?" she said, leading him to the sleeping infant. "His name is Erin." James stared in wonder at the child, gently touching his blue-tinted skin and five-fingered hands. Erin's eyes opened, and he reached up toward his father. "He recognizes you," Lyra whispered. "He has telepathic abilities. He can sense emotions and project his own." James carefully lifted the baby, who settled contentedly against his chest. "He's incredible." "And in danger," Lyra said urgently. "My father plans to take him tomorrow for testing. He sees Erin as a potential weapon, a new breed of Vordaxian warrior with human adaptability." James's expression hardened. "We need to get both of you out of here." "It won't be that simple," Lyra warned. "The palace security is designed to prevent exactly that. And even if we escaped, my father would hunt us across the galaxy." "Then we don't run," James said, his mind clearly working through strategies. "We change the game." He explained his plan quickly. Before coming to Vordax, he had secured backing from Earth's government. They saw the diplomatic potential in a child of both worlds. If Erin's existence could be revealed publicly, in the right way, it could force King Drax to acknowledge him properly rather than exploit him secretly. "Dr. Knoll has arranged for us to address the High Council tomorrow," James continued. "Many counselors already question your father's judgment in the border conflicts. This could be the tipping point." As the alarms in the distance began to quiet, signaling the end of their brief window, James reluctantly placed Erin back in his crib. "Be ready tomorrow," he said, cupping Lyra's face in his hands. "For all our sakes." Just before activating his stealth device, he pressed something into her hand, a small earth crystal on a chain. "For courage," he whispered, and then was gone, the wall rippling as he passed through it. Lyra clutched the crystal tightly, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. Tomorrow would determine the fate of her son, and perhaps of two species. The High Council chamber buzzed with tension as 12 of Vordax's most powerful leaders gathered for what they believed was an emergency session on border security. King Drax sat on his ceremonial throne, gill slits pulsing with irritation at the unexpected meeting. When Princess Lyra entered carrying baby Erin, whispers rippled through the chamber. When James followed her in, a human in the sacred council chamber, those whispers erupted into outraged shouts. "Silence!" King Drax roared, rising to his feet. "What is the meaning of this? Guards, wait!" Dr. Knoll stepped forward, placing himself between the royal guards and the couple. Honorable Council, what you are about to witness changes everything we thought we knew about our species. The council elder, Vor, raised a gnarled hand. Let them speak. Lyra stepped forward. Erin cradled against her chest. Esteemed council, I present to you my son, Erin. First of his kind, half Vordaxian, half human. Impossible, one counselor scoffed. The royal physicians declared you barren, said another. James moved to stand beside Lyra. What was thought impossible has happened. This child represents something unprecedented, the genetic strengths of both our species combined. King Drax's rage was visible, his massive frame trembling. This is treason. The child is to be studied under controlled conditions, not paraded before the council. Studied or weaponized? Lyra challenged. Father, you plan to raise my son as a tool for warfare. The king roared. The child belongs to the empire. The child belongs to his parents. Came a new voice. The ancient keeper of law, Terra, rarely spoke at council meetings, but when she did, all listened. Show us what this child can do. Lyra nodded to James, who took a small container from his pocket and released a tiny vial of blood. This contains a deadly virus that affects Vordaxians. We've exposed ourselves to it to demonstrate. Gasps echoed through the chamber as medical alarms began to sound. The virus was real. Now watch, Lyra said. She placed Erin's small blue hand on James's arm. The baby's eyes, brown with silver flecks, began to glow. The medical alarms monitoring James fell silent as the virus disappeared from his system. Lyra then placed the baby's hand on her own arm, with the same result. He can heal both species, Dr. Knoll explained, showing the medical readings to the stunned council. His immune system combines the strengths of both genetic lines, creating protection neither species possessed alone. There's more, Lyra said. She nodded to a guard at the door, who brought in a caged royal direwolf, the most dangerous predator on Vordax. The beast snarled and thrashed in its cage. Lyra stepped forward with Erin. The baby looked at the creature and extended one small hand. Instantly, the direwolf grew calm, lying down in its cage with a soft whine. He can communicate mentally with both sentient and non-sentient beings, James explained, beyond even Vordaxian telepathic abilities. The council members murmured in amazement. This child isn't a weapon, Lyra declared. He's a bridge between our worlds. Imagine what we could learn from each other if we worked together instead of preparing for war. The council elder, Vor, turned to King Drax. Your Majesty, this changes everything. The child represents an evolutionary leap forward. King Drax's rage had cooled to calculation as he watched the demonstrations. His gill slits pulsed more slowly now, a sign of deep thought. And what do you propose? He asked his daughter, his voice unexpectedly quiet. Recognize Erin as your legitimate heir, Lyra said boldly. Acknowledge his father as my chosen mate. Begin a new era of cooperation between our species. For a long, tense moment, the king was silent. The entire chamber held its breath. Then, slowly, King Drax descended from his throne and approached the child. Erin reached out a tiny 5-fingered hand and touched the king's massive face. Something passed between them, a telepathic communication no one else could hear. The king's expression changed. For the first time in Lyra's memory, she saw wonder in her father's eyes. My grandson, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. The first of a new dynasty. As the council erupted in excited discussion, Lyra and James exchanged looks of cautious triumph. They had gambled everything on this moment, and won a future for their child, and perhaps for both their worlds. The rage that had threatened to tear everything apart had transformed into something unexpected: hope.